Thank you so much for joining. I know we still have a lot of people coming into to join. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for making it out of your busy schedule. This is the University of Missouri Extension Ship and Good Monthly Webinar Series. My name is David Brown. I'm the MU Ship and Good Specialist, and today we have a very interesting topic. I know some of our producers about it's about timing for them to go into the breeding season. And so we're going to be talking about breeding, soundness, evaluation in sheep and goat today. But before we proceed, we'd like to just touch on two few things that we need to note. Number one, the webinar will be recorded as always, and we're going to post these on our Small Webinar YouTube channel, so you can have access to that at the end of the webinar. Also, we're going to send the PDF version of today's presentation to every one of you. So or you'll be able to, in case you have further questions, you have something to refer to. Like always, please type your questions in the chat box, and then we make sure that is answered as much as possible before or during the course of the presentation or when we finish the presentation. Today we have Dr. Chad Page. He's a ship and goat specialist from Utah State University. He's very passionate about small ruminant production and had the privilege of meeting with him during the American Lamb Summit in Idaho a few months ago. It's an honor for you, Dr. Page, to have you for us to have you today. I missed your busy schedule. Thank you for taking time to speak to our producers today. And without further ado, I just turn it over to Dr. Page to take it on today. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Brown. So, honored to be here with you guys today. Um, as explained, my name is Chad Page. I live in Utah. Most of my career, though, has been throughout the Mountain West. So I've lived in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and I've worked on big sheep operations, either doing research or something else for some time now. And so I'm happy to be on here today with you guys and talk to you. Interestingly enough, the last two graduate students I've had have been from Missouri, so I feel some kinship to you, even though I've never been to Missouri myself. So today, talking about ram and buck breeding soundness exams, I have probably some of the two more popular breeds of animals that you guys have in Missouri, both the boar goat and the Katahdin sheep represented here. And before I really started diving into the normal agenda talking about breeding soundness exams, I wanted to get a feel of what Missouri looks like as far as their sheep and goat numbers. And so, since really the early 2000s, sheep numbers across the US have stayed fairly steady with a gradual decrease by almost 2% every year across the nation. Well, that's not the case in Missouri. It looks like we've actually seen growth in both sheep and goat numbers in your guys' state, and it looks like goat numbers have more than doubled in the last 20 to 25 years, which is really good. It's a very exciting time. I think Dr. Brown can attest to that after our meeting with the Lamb Board in Idaho. It's a very exciting time for increase in lamb demand and goat throughout the United States. I also wanted to point out one of the most common questions that I get in my job. If anyone wants to take a guess, maybe write in the comments real quick, maybe what's one of the most common questions I get. We'll wait for a couple of those to go through, and then I'll answer this. I'd be interested to see what Dr. Brown thinks, what kind of questions he gets. If you do have any questions throughout this webinar, feel free to just write it in the chat box, and I will go ahead and answer those throughout the presentation so that if something isn't being understood very well, I can go ahead and answer those. So we have questions about when to start breeding, breeding techniques, and just remember that I'm a small ruminant specialist. So I work the same job as Dr. Brown, so I get questions about everything, right? Um, and actually, independent from breeding and things like that, one of the most questions I get is Where do I find a veterinarian? Right? And so I took a little look at the American Association of Small Ruminant Practitioners, which are veterinarians and some scientists, but practicing veterinarians. And your state has five right now, which is actually better than our state, which only has two that are registered in this. And so this is one source that you can find veterinarians for. So if you're looking for someone to come out and do breeding soundness exams for you, this can be a source to go back to and try to find some veterinarians. And hopefully, some of these are near you if you don't have a good relationship with your veterinarian already. So, I also wanted to point out that doing breeding soundness exams is actually a class that we do at USU. Every semester, I take out roughly 150 students to some large range operations, and we conduct roughly 400 breeding soundness exams in an afternoon, which is quite an undertaking with undergraduate students. But hopefully, we will have more veterinarians and people who know how to do these things because of classes and things like this. And so it's been a really great class. Prior to this, in my master's, I did work with rams and testosterone and zinc supplementation, things like that. This is actually a picture of the study from my master's, looking at ram development. Here they are exposed to a couple ewes before we did semen collection. But I wanted to point out, well, what is the purpose of your ram or buck? They have a couple main purposes. First and foremost, to successfully breed ewes, right? And we'll talk about how breeding soundness exams can help us to try to evaluate which rams have the best ability to successfully breed ewes, or at least have the tools. The next one is to produce lambs with desirable traits, right? So we want lambs that we can market, that we can sell, that maybe produce traits that we want. And lastly, improve flock genetics. And this could be genetics that are needed for survivability on your operation. Maybe it's parasite resistance, or maybe you're trying to do niche wool marketing. These are all things that are important. And so it kind of goes to the importance of, first and foremost, before breeding soundness exams ever happen, selecting rams and bucks that are crucial to the objectives of your operation, especially those that have good records. That you can try to choose for traits that are lowly heritable and that are hard to measure. And so some of those things may be based around reproduction, which are generally lowly heritable traits. So we want to make sure that reproduction stays high and that we are choosing sires and animals that do well. Parasite resistance is another one that is probably fairly well needed in your types of operations in Missouri, I would imagine. Maybe some animals that do well with hoof health in your regions is probably pretty important. And using some genetic markers or genetic tests that we have can help you also identify some of those animals. So choosing uh, good animals is probably the first and foremost, the biggest thing you need to do, even before looking at breeding soundness, is you want to make sure they have traits to pass on to the offspring that are actually going to be serving the objectives of your operation. Now, we also need to know a little bit about mating behavior and management. I see some questions coming through of, well, what traits should we look at? What is the best age for a ram or buck for soundness evaluation? We'll talk about that in a couple slides, and when is the best time to do breeding soundness exams. And also, what are some variabilities we see depending on the age of the animal, right? And so, but first, we kind of need to know sheep and goats, they're pretty seasonal, right? And for the most part, we also see the size, the ewes tend to congregate around the rams, and so they form this harem around the ram. So it's hard to say the ram that is chasing the most ewes is the best one breeding. That is generally a sign of high libido, but it's not to say he's going to father more lambs than maybe a ram that the ewes seek out more that maybe is just sitting by the water trough all day, right? Um, Other things that may affect the size of the harem, age of the ram. Okay, so a more matured, experienced ram should be able to handle a larger number of ewes, especially if those ewes are also mature and have gone through a breeding cycle before. Whereas yearlings, you would generally be a little bit more conservative and give them a smaller number of ewes to breed. And then if some of you are doing out of season breeding and maybe you're utilizing a breed that is fairly seasonal, and so you're using synchronization protocols, seeders, or things like that to breed at times of the year that would otherwise be harder to breed. You want to take that into account because now you're syncing a bunch of ewes that are all going to come into heat at the same time. You're going to need to increase the number of rams uh, that you have to service those ewes. Okay, and then also multi-sire breeding groups. I don't know what would you guys say? You can type it in the chat box. What would you say is maybe the normal size flock um, of sheep and or group of goats in Missouri? Here in the West, when we're dealing with some of our operations that are dealing with over 100 ewes, 1,000 ewes, even more than that sometimes, our rule of thumb is we have 3 rams per 100 ewes is a recommendation. Now, there have been some older studies that show one excellently scored ram can service a much larger number of ewes, and that is definitely the case. However, being conservative, the rule of thumb is generally 3 rams to 100 ewes in a multi-sire breeding group. So if one gets sick, one gets injured, is unable to service those ewes, that you do have backup animals. Another part of management, so we talked about synchronization protocol. One thing that is beautiful, I think, about the sheep and goat industry is we can take advantage of something called the ram effect. And so this is when you keep a ram away from your ewes or a billy away from your does for at least a month prior to breeding. And when you reintroduce them to those does or ewes, that those does and ewes will generally start cycling around the same time as each other. So you can do this through teasing. Those of you who may work in the show world have done this before, to try to tighten up your lambing window. So this is kind of a graph showing an older study that was done back in the 70s of 2 years where the ewes were teased and when the lambs came in their lambing season, and a year of unteased ewes. So you can see that these unteased ewes in this 1974 breeding season, they had a more extended or drawn out lambing season. And those that were teased synchronized their estrus a little bit more and had a much tighter lambing window than those that didn't, almost cutting it off by a week or so, just by keeping the ram away for a period of time and then reintroduction through pheromones and things like that. That's a pretty nice management technique that we can utilize in our breeding programs without having to buy additional drugs or anything like that. So if you only have so many weeks that you can really dedicate towards your lambing season, I would really encourage you to utilize things like the RAM effect or maybe um, synchronization protocol to try to tighten up your lambing window. And a shorter lambing window is also better for good relationships, right? Especially those of us who are working in the lambing barn with our spouses. So, let's get on to the breeding soundness. So this is kind of the heart of our discussion today. So breeding soundness exams, assuming we picked out those rams that are going to be most beneficial to us, um, we will go ahead and conduct a breeding soundness exam to evaluate if he has the tools needed in order to service those ewes. Before I kind of explain this, there was a question that came through. Um, how far of separation is recommended to remove a buck for the ram effect? And I would say generally out of sight. So as kind of as far as you can, but out of sight, out of smelling distance, so that there isn't kind of any teasing effect, because that teasing and ram effect can still happen fence line. And so if you had an intact male, you could still get somewhat of a teasing effect even if you introduced that ram fence line. Some research has even shown that even introducing a ram fleece into a group of ewes has initiated some of that estrus um, synchronization. Another question was, can adding more bucks to smaller doe groups have an effect on buck health? I would say yeah, especially if they're fighting, right? You put in some really dominant bucks or rams, they may spend a little bit more time fighting, which could also hurt one of your more expensive animals. And so limiting the number can sometimes be beneficial. But we also want to make sure all our animals get bred, right? First and foremost, you make money by selling lambs and kids. Okay, so when we're evaluating breeding soundness exams, breeding soundness exams are not essentially the best assessment. Is this ram or is this buck actually going to breed? Um, Lambing rates and kidding rates are our best indicator that he did his job, right? That he actually mounted and inseminated and successfully bred and fertilized that ewe. But breeding soundness exams at least give us a snapshot in time that we can evaluate and say, you know what? They have all the tools that they're needed in order to perform this job adequately and to increase our flock genetics and to breed these ewes. So there's three main components that we're going to talk about, and we'll talk about some management as we go through these. Number one, the first pillar is a physical evaluation. Okay. Number two is a scrotal evaluation, or sometimes we'll call this just a reprotract evaluation, looking at the glans penis, looking at the scrotum, everything else. And then lastly is a semen evaluation. So this is when we're actually collecting a semen sample and we're evaluating the semen underneath a microscope. Most of these things you as producers can do without a microscope, and you can go ahead and do a physical evaluation and a scrotal evaluation. Collecting semen is where it gets a little bit more difficult, and you may need a veterinarian or someone who knows what they're doing in order to help you. Now, once we've done evaluated these three main components, we are going to consider these RAMs in a couple categories. We're either going to say they're excellent based on the metrics that we measured, satisfactory, questionable. I always think of the Tarzan movie when I hear questionable. Seems questionable to me, right? And then lastly, unsatisfactory. These are rams, these are bucks that you do not want to use in your breeding program. And usually it will be some failure, maybe health wise, or it could even be something as simple as they have a trait that is unsatisfactory for you. So if you were a wool producer and you wanted to produce finer wool and you said, you know what, this year I'm going to have a cutoff of a certain micron, and you have rams coming through that have higher micron than that, you may just say, well, that ram is unsatisfactory to me, especially since wool is a highly heritable trait, similar to carcass characteristics. So depending on those BSEs, and if we think they're exceptional, satisfactory, or questionable, may change how we manage our breeding season, the number of rams that we put to a group of ewes or to a group of does, or if we actually need to source new rams if we have rams or bucks that fail our breeding soundness exam. Now, a lot of the information I'm going to give is very specific to sheep, but it also goes directly to goats in a lot of ways. And where there is literature that is maybe a little bit more specific to goats, I'll try to tease that out and make mention specifically for it. But the fact of the matter is, and maybe Dr. Brown can agree with me, is there's not as much literature and research based around goat reproduction in comparison to sheep. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about sheep than I will goats, but I will try to specify when there is goat specific information. Okay. So the breeding soundness exam, when do we do that? I think that was one of the questions that came through from Dr. Muhammad Ali. When to do this? How old does a ram need to be? Well, we should generally do this roughly 60 days prior to our breeding season. Okay. The farther away from your breeding season you do this, the less that snapshot picture in time is going to tell you how successful he will be in his breeding season. If you looked at the actual amount of time it takes for sperm cells to mature and develop, it takes roughly, I think, 54 days in a ram and similar in a billy goat. So we're doing this about the time it takes to produce and mature viable sperm cells. Now, this is really good because it also gives us time to make management decisions around it. So, we preferably want to be close to the breeding season. The closer we are, the better shot and time it tells us. But we want to do it with enough time out that we can change up our management if we have to. So, questionable rams, we can then test 30 to 40 days after. So, if a ram got sick, or maybe they experienced extreme stress through transportation after you bought them, or any other thing like that. Maybe they were dealing with an injury and their semen was bad for a period of time. This allows them to kind of get over that. We can test them again before we put them in with our ewes. Now, if they're dealing with serious immune function issues, we may want to just seek out a different sire for that year. I have seen a wide variety of costs. I'm not sure what we see most common in Missouri, but I see anywhere from $18, which I know is extremely low for some of you that are listening on right now. But this cost is generally associated with guys that are getting like 300 to 400 rams tested in a day or two by veterinarians, and so that is extremely low. What I hear more often is somewhere 55 and maybe even above for someone to come to your operation and test your rams, or if you have to haul your rams and billies to the veterinarian for them to test. So it really varies on the cost of doing this. But if you do this, say it does cost you $55, and you think, man, that's a lot of money to test my rams or billies. Well, that's a small price to pay instead of having a bunch of open ewes or does on a breeding season, right? That's a much bigger price to pay. So we also want to make sure that the rams are met to breed during that time of year. So if we have a very seasonal breed of animal versus an a-seasonal breed of animal, the Dorset probably being the poster boy of out of season breeding, we should expect that they have better numbers, semen wise, and everything else in the off season than we would a more seasonal animal like a Suffolk, right? Where they maybe don't do quite as well breeding out of season. Another thing with the physical evaluation, and this, I really my students probably get sick of it, but I like talking about body condition scoring because it is simple, it costs no money, and it gives you a really good idea of where these animals are sitting metabolically. And so, weight doesn't really tell us a lot in comparison because body condition score will tell us, okay, do they have enough fat storage that they've met their needs for immune function and reproduction and all these other things that we're able to then turn these rams out. Ideally, we want roughly a 3.5 body condition score. And you're going to assume that during the breeding season, especially here in the West where we have animals out on range eating low quality forage, our rams, we expect them to lose roughly 15% of their body weight during the breeding season. Now, that's essentially 12 to 14% of an animal's body weight is roughly one body condition score. So if you turned out a buck with a bunch of does and he lost, 12 to 14% of his body weight, he's going to drop from a 3.5 body condition score to a 2.5. Now, the research shows that emaciated rams and bucks are going to have a worse morphology and lower motility in their semen. Okay. Um, and so having emaciated animals isn't meeting their needs for both maintenance and potentially growth. So if you're going to try to use young rams or young bucks, they're actively growing while they're trying to perform these reproductive issues. And so when you look at the hierarchy of what's needed in the body, reproduction really is a luxury event. You have to meet all the needs of the animal prior to good reproduction and good sound reproduction. Okay. And so we would do this, and I'm sure this is on many other seminars that you've done with Dr. Brown, um, on feeling the back of the animal, especially if you have wool type sheep. With our goats, with our Katahdins, oftentimes we can look out at the animals and we can see. But if you have wool type sheep, you're really going to want to get hands on those animals, and you're going to want to feel that spinal process to ensure that there's enough fat coverage for that breeding season. So if there isn't, those 4 to 6 weeks out, so this is a little bit around the time that we're doing these breeding soundness exams, which is perfect. We have hands on the animals. We can start feeding supplemental feed to put condition back onto our animals. So there's another kicker of why you should go ahead and do that breeding soundness exam roughly 2 months out from your breeding season. Okay. I imagine a lot of you have maybe even already started breeding. And so this is after the fact, but you can go ahead and change that in future years. Another big aspect that we like to look at for longevity of the animal is physical evaluation of the mouth. Are there abscess in the mouth? Are there issues with jaw alignment? So in this scoring card here from the Australian Lamb Associations, we see a really good case of score one would be parrot mouth. And then score five is what we often refer to as monkey jaw, right? This picture right adjacent to the score five, this is actually a cloned Romney ram that we have here at Utah State University. And he gets a really good pass on life. He doesn't have to have great production traits because he's a clone, he's utilized for different things, right? But he has an extremely bad underbite. And so this is a really good example of what monkey jaw would look like. In a production setting, this animal I would probably use to cull. If I had him out on range or a pasture, he'd probably have a harder time maintaining body weight because of the misalignment of his jaw, right? Here we see some other examples of some extremely worn down teeth and actually a true gummer. Now, I may go back to this picture later, but this animal we saw several years in a row, and it had essentially was no teeth, right? A true gummer, but every year he maintained body weight in a very rough environment. And every year he had proper physical evaluation for semen and for himself with good traits like fine wool and things like that. So, in a very big operation, this animal was still able to fulfill his job as a ram, even with this going on. So, you really need to look at the big picture. Now, would this be hard in very tough years, droughts, things like that? Yes. So we want to go ahead and check mouse. This becomes a really big thing. Another thing, and I imagine that I maybe should have made a slide more on hoof health for this crowd specifically in Missouri. But some other things to think about is feet, legs. So are they bow-legged? Do they have a good gait? Are they walking correctly? Can they travel through your pastures? And if they can't do that well and you really want to use them for their genetics, maybe doing a more confined breeding may be advantageous for that ram or for that buck. Body temperature, knowing that sheep should be around 103 degrees, and that their scrotal temperature will actually be slightly lower than that core body temperature. Foot rot. So, like I said before, we don't want animals struggling with physical or immune challenges during breeding because then they're going to put more energy into that than they are spermatogenesis and going ahead and doing their job. If they're too tender to walk, they're probably too tender to go out and mount ewes and mount does. And so that becomes important. Looking for things like ringworm, pink eye, sore mouth. And if you've not had it on your operation and you're buying new breeding animals, look for these things so that you're not bringing in issues to your operation. Especially those of us who do show animals, ringworm, sore mouth, these things are abundant in show animals that, or really any animals that congregate in the same area, these types of diseases spread. Okay. Here's another picture of a ram that had really tight horns. And so prior to the breeding season, if he's dealing with an immune response to an ailment, a physical laceration, whether it be from a predator, a dog, in this case, the horns growing into the side of the animal. These things all need to make sure that they're handled and maintained prior to your breeding season. Now, that's kind of one more thing I should add in here is parasites for you guys in Missouri, right? We need to make sure that these animals are not spending so much energy going towards parasites, and not only that, but parasite resistance being moderately heritable, roughly I think 40%, right? We want to make sure that we're actually choosing for animals that do have parasite resistance to do better on our operation, right? And we want to weigh out those characteristics. So there are now EBVs. I know the Katahdin Association uses them. Here at Utah State, we have St. Croix that are really well known for parasite resistance. Um, you want to make sure that you select for those traits. Now, the ram reproductive tract, we're not going to go through, and this isn't an anatomy class per se, but it is important to point out a couple things about our ruminant animals, so our sheep and our goats. Sheep, specifically on the end of their glans penis, they have something called a filiform appendage. Sometimes you'll hear veterinarians call this just the urethral process, which technically it is, but it functions a little bit differently. They also, ruminant animals, have something called a sigmoid flexure, where it has this S-shaped curve up inside the cavity, body cavity of the animal. And when they erect, have an erection, this will straighten out. And then that's when we actually see the end of the glans penis. Um, when they ejaculate, this filiform appendage on rams actually spins around fairly violently and disperses semen throughout the repro tract of the female. And so it does serve a purpose. Now, the reason I wanted to point out specifically the appendage and the sigmoid flexure is because we often deal with something called urinary calculi, or sometimes we call this water belly. It also has more scientific names, but this is what most commonly we would refer it to. You'll generally see rams or billies that will have increased fluid buildup in their abdomen that will hang low in their belly, hence why we call it water belly. They will sometimes kick at that. They'll have a hard time urinating. It'll drizzle instead of an actual good stream flow of urine. And if you start seeing these things, you could probably start seeing uh, trying to deal with water belly. Sometimes it gets to the point where you need to call a veterinarian and you need to go ahead and operate on that animal. In Utah, I see this the most. The animals that are most susceptible to it are wethers, especially those people who have pet wethers who tend to give them a lot of grain, even though the animal doesn't necessarily work a lot. And then also a lot of show animals that are growing very fast on a grain diet. Ultimately, urinary calculi is associated with an imbalance of calcium to phosphorus. Grains, so like corn, barley, has a much higher amount of phosphorus than it does calcium. Whereas we look at some of our legumes have higher calcium to phosphorus. Sheep generally do pretty good with pretty high amounts of calcium, but the optimal ratio is roughly 2 to 1. So most balanced feeds will be around a 2 to 1 ratio to try to ensure that we're not dealing with urinary calculi issues. Now, what you can do is you can offer maybe a grain diet, but then a free choice low quality hay, which oftentimes can put that balance back. Or you can also feed ammonium chloride at roughly 0.05% of their diet to help acidify the urine and help prevent this calculi. This is often an ingredient that's already added in if you're buying show feed or you're buying pellets or something from a mill. This is something that you often see in. If you have issues with that, and the animal goes down, you're going to want to call your veterinarian and they may need to operate. Oftentimes, it's just a clog of those stones in this appendage, and they're able to come snip this off, and then the stones can unlodge and come out a little bit easier. But if that clog is in the sigmoid flexure, which is a little bit more common with wethers, because their urethral process doesn't expand as much as intact males, you may have some clogged here, and then that becomes more of an operation. I've actually worked with a couple goat people that have had several operations, and so it's important to understand how this happens, and it's largely a diet issue. South Dakota State actually did a ton of research on it back in the 60s, a real plethora of information. So once we've done the physical evaluation, we've helped maintain, we understand the repro tract, we go to the scrotal evaluation. The scrotal evaluation, what we want to do is we're gonna take the testes, we're gonna pull them down taut. We're gonna hold up close to the abdomen, pull the testes down taut inside of the scrotum, and we're gonna feel first, we're gonna palpate for if the testes are both of similar size and of similar tone. And when I say tone, how hard or how soft do they feel? If they're really soft and squishy, it's usually a good indicator of infection, and same with very hard testicles. And I'll give you some examples of those in just a second. When we evaluate the scrotum, we have them pulled down taut next to each other in the scrotum. We're going to want to measure around that scrotal circumference with rams that are younger. So if we're using our younger rams, this goes back to Dr. Muhammad Ali's question. If we're using younger bucks, we will have slightly lower expectations for scrotal circumference size. They're still maturing, they're still growing. We're going to have to feed them appropriately to both breed and to develop during this time. So with rams, we would want to see at least satisfactory animals somewhere between 30 and 36 centimeters. Above 36 centimeters for a young ram is considered actually exceptional. Now, if these are mature males that are maybe breeding for the first time as a yearling, or they're into their second breeding season, we're gonna, for it to be considered exceptional in this category, they need to have over a 40 centimeter scrotal circumference, which is actually very impressive if you know a lot about other animals. Like this is size of like a yearling bull. Like that's pretty impressive. 30 to 40, 32 to 40 centimeters will be considered satisfactory, and below 32 centimeters is considered questionable. Now you can choose to keep that animal to breed, but you may want to stack that group of ewes with maybe another ram, right? Or give him less ewes to breed. And I tend to see a little bit more blackface animals, so our terminal animals have a smaller scrotal circumference. So a question about scrotal circumference came in, and I see a deworming protocol. Let's get to that after the presentation. So if you can remind me, but the scrotal measurements are breed dependent. Sometime, most commercial sheep you'll see around this. Now, if you're breeding smaller South Downs or maybe baby doll sheep, then yes, take that into uh, consideration. Same with mini Nubians, which you did there, or kinder goats or something else like that, right? Um, your normal commercial bucks, so your Boer goats, which are probably most prevalent in the state, or Kikos, your larger size goats, you're going to expect them to have above a 25 centimeter when they're matured. Okay. And so you'll see it is lower in goats than it is rams. But so this is one of those goat specific things. Now it is going to be different for those smaller breeds, like you asked. And so just keep that in consideration. The reason this is important is because those rams and bucks with bigger testicles actually generally have superior reproductive traits. And one of those traits is not only do they reach puberty earlier, but even their daughters generally reach puberty earlier. And so they're carrying traits that are generally lower heritability and that you can select for. Now, larger scrotal circumference is also um, tied in with higher libido, higher testosterone production, more sperm production. And so these are generally reproductively better animals. Now, we do see a lot of issues. So here's a picture of a ram that had extremely large testicles, but very abnormal. And when we palpated these testicles, they were extremely hard, and so there's definitely some infection going on. Another thing that you'll see very common is when one testicle looks very large in comparison to the other, and then you go ahead and palpate those testicles, you'll see that it's usually the head or tail of the epididymis, like in this picture here, has been injured or susceptible to disease and has enlarged and hardened. Now, this testicle is actually no good, um, and we don't want to use these animals for breeding. So, if your animal has epididymitis, you're going to want to that's just unsatisfactory. Get rid of that animal. You don't want them to breed in your group. Now, the important for testing, if you're running a lot of animals, um, it can be daunting to test a lot of animals because it's a big cost. But we do need to test for B. ovis. And if our animals have B. ovis, I highly recommend you cull them. You need to cull them. It's generally a state reportable disease. Um, but if your animals have B. ovis, they're much more likely to have epididymitis, and you're much more likely to have a lower lamb crop and more abortions in your ewes if B. ovis is present in your flock. So it's important to test. It's important to cull for these types of things. So this is kind of why it's important to do scrotal evaluation, reproductive tract evaluation. There is a question that just came up about split scrotums. Um, I that's just a trait generally I'm not a big fan of is a lot of cleavage in a scrotum. Um, but it's not to say that those animals, if they meet these other criteria, won't be they can still breed. But it is a heritable trait, and so depending on what your willingness is to uh, continue kind of that trait of a lot of cleavage or a split scrotum, you can use that animal or not. It's generally a trait I don't really like, and I don't know if I've ever seen any literature that says split scrotums have lower or higher reproductive traits. I'll have to look into that. So maybe that's some homework for me. Um, at the same time, we're going to want to look at feel up at the look at the gland's penis and things, and usually you'll do that when you're collecting semen. So when we do collect semen, there are two ways to do it: artificial vagina and electroejaculator. Your most common, what you'll see is an electroejaculator. Here's a picture of my students holding an electroejaculator, just a small handheld that you could buy on um, like Premiere One or something like that. And I think it costs around $500. And we've been pretty successful utilizing these. There are much nicer ones that you can also buy. But this doesn't take much time. You don't have to train the animal, and you generally get a pretty good sample, at least for analysis, to conduct a breeding soundness exam. Now, an artificial vagina has been known to get better sample collections. However, it does take a lot more time in order to train the animal to collect off an artificial vagina. And so that is an example here of this gentleman collecting via artificial vagina. So that ram willing to mount another animal in his presence, or sometimes this is a dummy. But in most commercial animals, you won't see this being utilized with sheep and goats. You'll generally see electroejaculator, except for maybe those of you who are buying semen from like really big show operations that conduct you collect a lot on the same animal and sell it. You'll see the use of artificial vagina. So, um, looks like Dr. Brown did put in a comment about the split scrotum if you would all like to look at that. Um, is there a relationship between testicles descending setup and sex of lambs? Not that I know of. I'm Can you clarify that question a little bit? Um, I'm not exactly sure if I know exactly what you're asking there. So if once you do get an adequate sample, and so when you do get a sample from a ram or from your goat, you're going to want to make sure that it's looks adequate. Another thing that some veterinarians and people do, they'll actually smell it. So you're going to be smelling for infection, and you're going to look at it for swirls. And so rams and goats actually have pretty high sperm concentration. So here's an example of a ram here versus a bull and a boar, so a pig. Pigs have very high ejaculate volumes, right? So they're ejaculating a lot of semen at one time. However, rams and billies generally ejaculate a very small amount. So a ram will ejaculate generally 1 to 3 mils of semen, which is very little, right? But it is very concentrated. So roughly 2 to 3 times the concentration of a bull. So we're looking at roughly 2 to 3 billion sperm cells per mil of ejaculate. So if he ejaculated 2 mils at 3 billion per mil, we're talking roughly 6 billion sperm cells in that ejaculate alone to service that female. Okay. We talked about the spermatogenesis cycle and the influence of libido and testosterone production with rams with large testicles. Now, once we have that sample, it should be opaque slash white in color. If it is very clear, it is probably a lot of pre-ejaculate without a lot of semen. If it has any tinge of pink, it's probably a sign of blood, which the probably the worst things for ram semen or goat semen is blood and water, right? And then temperature. But so if you're seeing signs of blood, that's a bad thing, and you're going to want to look into why that is. And sometimes, and I've seen examples of blood will pull back the sheath of the ram, and we may see infection on the end of the glans penis. That animal may need to be treated by a veterinarian or figure out why that is. Another thing to look at would be to make sure the ram doesn't have any pizzle rot when you're doing that physical evaluation. So, in order to be considered satisfactory for a ram, and I'll just put goats into the same category right now, we're going to want above um, somewhere be somewhere between 30 and 70% motile, and so this is progressively moving forward. Now, if you look roughly into a microscope and you see a lot moving, you're going to want to, what we do often is we'll dilute that down so we can actually look at individual sperm cells, and we'll put it on a grid pattern, and we'll actually count how many of those sperm cells actually swim forward versus just in circles, right? Um, to be considered exceptional, motility would need to be above 70% for rams and goats. And then morphology, we'd want for exceptional rams above 80%. Some of the main issues that we would see, especially with young rams, we would see issues with distal and proximal cytoplasmic droplets. And so if we looked at one of these pictures here, and the droplet is generally connected to the tail region of, this isn't probably a great example of it either, but it's a small droplet that's on connected to the tail that is going to affect their ability to swim. And so we'll see that with maybe virgin rams or rams that have little to no experience. Um, and then we want to make sure we analyze the semen fast. Really, you have the faster the better. 12 minutes is really your cutoff mark to see anything. And in suboptimal temperatures and things like that, this number is actually going to be much lower in comparison. I want to point out, and we're kind of to the conclusion of this talk, and then we'll go ahead and take some questions. But I wanted to point out a really large survey slash study that was done from the year 2000 to 2007. This is the same year that Missouri sheep and goat numbers just started exploding, right? Um, but this was done in the western U.S., so Colorado, Wyoming, these types of states where there's a lot of rams on one operation. And so these are some of the categories that we talked about. So unsatisfactory rams, what would consider them to fail? So a B Ovis test, if it was positive, immediate fail, right? Most of the rams that also failed were below 26 centimeter scrotal, um, and and so on and so forth in this, right? Epididymitis and an immediate fail. Now, if we looked at our questionable rams, so these are the ones that you may or may not use for breeding. You may have to put more of them into a group of ewes or does in order to get your same pregnancy rates. You can see that something like let's see, progressive sperm motility is lower, like we talked about. But all of these, we need an optimal semen collection in order to evaluate them, right? And then it gives our excellent potential animals and our satisfactory, you can see that their body condition is at least above a 2.4 and a 3. Now, these are animals on very in extensive operations out on range. And so this body condition is probably a little bit lower than those of us who have animals close to us or are maybe eating more feed without having to walk and be herded. Um, but we would want this body condition score, kind of going back to the beginning of this uh, talk on, we want this roughly a 3.5, assuming they're going to lose weight during their breeding season. So there's a lot of literature out there. There's a lot of things like zinc supplementation, optimal minerals, things that can also help. There's more management strategies on using breeding harnesses to know what animals are bred, or using pregnancy testing after your breeding soundness exam has been conducted, after those rams have bred your ewes. And I encourage you to still utilize those tools with your ewes for pregnancy testing in order to ensure a successful lambing and kidding season. But given the talk today, kind of in summary, we want to make sure we select quality rams. It's a very small percentage of our animals that really affect all the genetics and the rest of our animals. So it does not hurt, in my opinion, to spend a little money and extra time taking care of these animals that are going to make all the difference. Maximize your maternal and terminal traits in these animals. Make sure you choose animals with good data. And then, even though the breeding soundness exam is not foolproof for a successful breeding season, it at least weans out the animals that are that will be unsatisfactory and allows you to have a much higher percentage chance of being successful during your breeding season. Um, thanks you for having me. I hope this was helpful for some of you to think about things or management wise or what you can do at home, even if you don't have access to a veterinarian. And with that, I'll go ahead and take some questions, Dr. Brown.
Oh, thank you, Dr. P. That was very loaded. Thank you for the information. Thank you. Just a few questions that came into me because some people sent questions ahead of time, and I was supposed to even let you know that. Someone wanted to know if it's stress reduce fertility. It's stress. Does that reduce fertility?
Yes, it does actually. So if you talk about, um, let me let me pull up another slide from another talk, some of my classes. So here's a slide that kind of talks about the effects of temperature on sperm quality. So if you're thinking about heat stress in general, this is where, heat stress in sheep is actually somewhat of a dark rabbit hole, I think. In my PhD, I thought it'd be fun to start looking into heat stress. But with wool, especially with a lot of commercial sheep in the West, it's such an insulating factor. There's less research than there is, even with goats. Goats actually have more research on heat stress than sheep do. But now, with the increase of hair sheep in the United States, I think we'll see more and more heat stress type research. And so the optimal temperature for rams is roughly 96 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is slightly below that optimal body temperature, which is like 102, 103, um, or even up to 104. And so if it drops or goes above that, and the animal can't thermal regulate enough, now luckily for us, the testicles are very complex mechanism in order to cool themselves down. And so you have things like the pampiniform plexus, was essentially is a large cooling mechanism in order to disperse heat through blood. You also have the cremaster muscle, which pulls the testes either up close to the body when it's cold or it drops them low. And so the body does do a pretty good job doing this. But if your animal is suffering with extreme heat stress, then you may see a reduction in viable semen samples and maybe even a reduction in the number of ewes he's able to service. Um, and so it's kind of the same thing with ewes that are under conditioned when they lamb. Oftentimes, they're not going to want to take care of that lamb. They're going to try to fit their own needs. And so they're going to go to the feed bunk, right? Well, if a ram can't cool down, he's going to be more concerned about staying in the shade than servicing ewes. And so heat stress does become a thing. And so if you have ways to mitigate that, if you're trying to breed in very hot times of the year, you may want to think about mitigating that. And oftentimes you guys are the best stewards of your animals. And so I'm sure that many of you can see that as you watch your animals.
Excellent.
So,
Dr. Page, you have a few questions from the in the chat box if you want to take about
yeah.
we have 4 minutes. So Ruth was asking how much influence do the books have on the sex of kids? If you can say that in the chat box.
Where is that at? How
R-
much influence do?
the box have on the sex of kids. Ruth, just above the page where answer Dr. Mohammed, or
Oh,
below rather.
yeah. I mean, the the Bucks and the Rams will be the ones that decide the sex of the animals, right? As far as I know, chickens are the only ones where the female actually determines the sex. But if we're having an optimal lambing or kidding percentage closer to 200, right? It's going to be pretty 50-50 on what we're going to get. So on any given year, if you say, well, I need X number of ewes for replacements, but you are only running half the number of mature ewes, you may have to then go out and find and buy ewes. And so I would just always think that you're going to get roughly half males, half females. But yes, the bucks are going to be the ones that determine that. But you're more importantly for you making money is the ewes are the ones that are going to ovulate one or two oocytes, which is more important for your lambing and kidding percentages. But bucks, like we said, larger scrotal circumference does affect your ewes' reproductive traits. So you still want to select good maternal bucks to work in your environment. Yeah, good question.
Excellent. Yeah, next question, Dr. Page. What age do you consider replacing your bulk on an average? At what age?
Some here in the West, the problem is they die too fast, right? And so that's generally our bigger issue. But I would say that it really is more dependent on how fast are you dealing with inbreeding coefficients, right? So if you have one ram and he's produced a significant number of your replacement ewes that is your flock now, you're going to want to make sure that you get new genetics to ensure that you have no inbreeding issues on your operation. But if you have a lot of groups of ewes and you have a ram that consistently works good, you can keep that ram for quite a bit longer. But I don't really want to give an average there. I think it's different for everyone. But the biggest thing is to make sure that you're not dealing with inbreeding. So you don't want to be breeding that ram back to his own offspring, per se, or to brother or to sisters or anything like that. So,
Excellent. Misha, I just send you an email. If you want to please send me an email on the development protocols. I think that's another topic. We've dealt with that a lot of times, and I can send you the information and some materials that may help you. Please send me an email. I just put my email right in the chat box. Dr. Page, you can take one more Is there anyone there that I see? I think it's 1 o'clock, so we can call it a day.
Okay.
Okay, Dr. P, let's take one more. Can I breed Suffolk with a dopper? That's the last question. Can I breed a Suffolk with a dopper?
Yeah, I would say that you always want to kind of, I mean, you can definitely do that. People are crossing hair sheep, right? Depending on how you market them, you might want to be think about that. So if you're going to a plant that doesn't want hair contaminant or anything like that, you may want to think about that. But we're seeing that more and more, and I think we're going to continue to see that because of the increase of hair sheep in the U.S. The wool side of me. Um, has a hard time with that, but that's another discussion for another day. So, but
Excellent.
yep, yeah,
Thank you, Dr. Page. We can go on and on today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the wealth of information you brought today to our
yeah,
producers. We greatly appreciate you. Don't forget that we're going to send a PDF version of this presentation to all of you, and also we're going to post this on our MU Small Remnant YouTube page. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next month. Dr. Page, take care and thank you so much.
thank you.
Bye.